We're going to try to do a half a chapter today. And I heard a giggle. It's quite possible. And I think of, what just preceded us. Again, as Nehemiah, having assessed the damage in that night excursion, as he would go in that cloak of secrecy and bringing some select men, these counselors, these advisors, men that he knew would help him see things that he might miss, men that would contribute wisdom, men that would keep him from folly, men that would keep him accountable, men that would make sure what God wanted to do through the nation and through the building of that wall and through Nehemiah would be solidified. And he would go, and of course you remember the rubble was so bad that at one point he had to ditch his Jeep, or wasn't a Jeep, it was a donkey, his off-road vehicle, because he says the rubble was so high he had to get rid of his traveling companion. He parked his SUV and he went by foot. He went on foot patrol. And if you recall, and I think you can see that, is there were some great sighs that took place as he would exhale, as he would panoramically look at the destruction that was done to the walls. And of course I would imagine in many ways reminiscing and reflecting on those battles where a siege would come against the city that he loved, and it was destroyed, and the king was taken captive, and the men were killed, and the women and the virgins were taken captive, and it must have brought back all of that hardship. And sometimes that's a good thing. I mentioned that before, how as God would give us a panoramic view of His grace, I think many times He couples that with a panoramic view of our sin. I think it's important, again, not to be condemned by the depravity that we are naturally, but to be mindful of it. Yeah. We need to be mindful of it as we see, the body and man in general fall into traps and into snares and be deceived. We too are easily susceptible to that. We too have a like nature like that. And, it's kind of funny, when I was doing a player study at the college for a couple of years, we had heard about a young man. Actually, no, we didn't hear about a young man. We were going through Mark chapter 2, and we were looking at the paralytic who was carried by his friends on a pallet. In the New King James, it says that he was carried on a mat. So I had lovingly dubbed his name Matt. So his 4 friends were taking Matt to see Jesus, and you guys know the story. And of course, what we can glean from how the Scriptures records his condition is we know most likely it was something he had contracted through a sexually transmitted disease. And it brought corruption and decay to his body. Now, what we find in the Scriptures is that there was this love amongst his friends, and they knew that the remedy was to take their friend, who is now bedridden and a paralytic, to Christ. And I remember as I was studying over that and I was praying about that, I wonder if that night, whether it was a lifestyle of sin that this Matt engaged in, or if it was one night of indiscretion, whatever, I imagine his 4 friends must have been with him. And he was the one who got caught. He was the one who got the sexually transmitted disease. He was the one who got arrested, and the other 4 got away. And I always thought about that, if some of them wanting to bring his friend Matt to see Christ wasn't out of guilt. And as I was ministering to these players, these football players, I reminded them, it's like the difference between him who had that disease, and us is basically the word yet. We haven't been caught yet. We haven't caught it yet. That's the only difference between really me and someone sitting in jail, is the yet before Christ. I just wasn't caught. Right? Neither were any of you. Some of you were, and anyways. But I thought about that, and as it ties into Nehemiah, that time of reminiscing and reflected must have seized his heart. But what's cool about the way the Lord would use that to seize his heart, it would birth out of him passion and a desire to work. Man, it says, we're going to learn tonight, that they had a mind to work. It was shut up in their bones. Like Jeremiah, they burned with vision and they burned with passion, and they got it done. Again, it sets for us an example and a precedent that we should follow in regards to the things that God wants to do. So Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 1, and we're going to finish in 9 so that we might pray. And this is what it says. It says, "But it so happened So I guess if I could put it into more of a contemporary sort of wording, it's like, and the plot thickened. And the, yeah, dun 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 dun. It says, when Sanballat heard that we, referring there to Nehemiah and his coalition of workers, were rebuilding the wall, it says that he, referring to Sanballat, was furious and very indignant, and he mocked the Jews. So it sounds like Sanballat, as we're going to learn from verse 2, that he was sort of shut down there in his headquarters, and these reports started to come in. Again, these sort of news flashes as they were coming into headquarters. And as I thought about that, as he probably heard various reports, and I would imagine they probably came in probably two different tones. One of agony, the tale of agony by the Arabs as they heard the wall being built, and then probably reports of celebration from the Jews. And God's doing a work and getting excited about it. And it says that the reports came in that Jerusalem was being resurrected. And his response, it says there that he flew into a rage and essentially lost his temper. Now his name being Sanballat, it made me think of the Hurricane Sandy. Sanballat, Sandy. And like the hurricane, man, I worked on that for weeks. And I was thinking, that's so cheesy, but it's kind of funny. But imagine like the hurricane there, Sanballat, and then he just exploded. There was this intense anger and this animosity towards the Jews. And his response, of course, naturally, was to begin to circulate taunts, these vile insults, and I would imagine this despairing threats. Again, he had this hostile attitude towards the Jews. And as I sat there and I looked at him sort of vilifying the Jews and mocking them, I wonder what his motive was. And I wonder if in some degree he did not begin to see the Jews as a threat. As a threat. I know the church is a great threat against Satan. So he would mock them. And it says there in verse 2 that Sanballat, again Hurricane Sandy, began to speak before his brethren. Again, this was sort of a commander's address. Again, he's the general, and he's sort of the head, the spearhead of this work. And he's there in the quarters. And it says that he was beginning to talk to his brethren. Now, what we're going to discover is these were his associates. And I got here in my notes, they were probably cronies. These were these yes men. And I say that because of their response. But it also says there, and the army of Samaria. Now, obviously, he could not have the entire army there, but I think it's sort of indicative of the military officers. And I say that because we find that in Ezra chapter 4, verses 9 through 10. But what Ezra does, and Nehemiah doesn't do it, probably because his scribe Ezra did it, is he sort of gave you an idea of all the different nations that would have comprised Samaria at this time. We learned through Ezra chapter 4, it records that there was a multitude of people in these diverse nations, and they were taken captive formerly by the king of Assyria. Now there in Ezra, he is named as O Snapper, or perhaps it's probably got more of a Hebrew, pronunciation, but in my English dialect, it's like, oh, Snapper. But what's crazy is that's actually short for his full name, which I'm getting ready to butcher right now. It is Ashur Beneful. That's why they called him O Snapper. Anyways, but Ezra records that. And then we see here, while he's standing before his brethren and before the army, he would begin to say, what are these feeble Jews doing? Again, at this point, he would have seen them as impotent. Again, they would have been sort of convalescent-like. They would have been tired. And again, I would imagine his tone would have been sort of one absurdity. What are they doing? What does that little chapel think they're doing, praying every day for people in this land? What do they think they're actually going to accomplish because they want to teach the Bible line upon line? Right? Imagine. And then he says, and he goes on with this taunt, he says, will they fortify themselves? In other words, the language there talks about, will they find a way to sort of break themselves from their feeble condition? In other words, are they trying to find a way to change their ways? And he says there, will they offer sacrifices? Now what he was alluding to here was worship. Now at this time, of course, the impression is that the nation of Israel would not have been known for worship, but actually known for idolatry, harlotry, and forsaking the Lord. So his attitude is kind of like, now you call on the Lord? And doesn't that happen in our lives? You know, when things are prior to Hurricane Sandy, you know, and things are going good, it's like we're not mindful of the Lord. You know, and as we're watching the Doppler and we see it coming closer, we might sort of, you know, rehash, hey, how you doing up there? Big guy in the sky, or whatever blasphemous, you know, way you acknowledge him when you're not abiding with him. And we really don't draw near to him until really either in the eye of the storm or have gone through, you know, some type of hardship. And that was his implication. It's like, after all these years, hundreds of years of following Baal, Moloch, Asherah, and all these things, and now you're going to call on Jehovah, the Lord thy God? Now all of a sudden you're going to do it? And the reason he was saying this is because he assumed in his heart that they would begin to offer sacrifices of thanksgiving once the wall was built. You see, the nation was known for doing dedication ceremonies. I already had it all planned in my heart. If we would have continued with the school, I was going to invite Pastor Wall down to dedicate the building. Someday, I believe that ceremony will take place. But they always wanted to commemorate the work that God was doing to the Lord. So they would have a feast and they would celebrate. But then Sanballat also says, will they complete it in a day? Now, in many ways, he's acknowledging their he's acknowledging their work ethic and their inspiration, but he's discrediting it. Remember, he's mocking them, and he's mocking the Jews because they were looking to God to build the wall. The psalmist would say, unless the Lord builds this house, he who labors in vain. But what I love about that is he must have saw their attitude. They knew with God all things were possible. Now, in the natural, they were inexperienced builders. Inexperienced builders, and yet they trusted in the Lord and they believed it could have been done in one day. Now, Sanballat would continue and say, will they revive the stones from the heaps of rubbish? Again, there was this piles of rubbish, and as I was going through this, and it's kind of, you know, chic and hip today, but Nehemiah was going to recycle and repurpose. You know, sort of a rehab addicts. You know, the television shows on HGTV or whatever. But ultimately, Nehemiah knew that God would bring new life to these stones. And here it would say that these stones then were burned. And again, they were charred debris, and they were smoldering materials. Ultimately, they were ruined. They were seen by everybody as being irreparable. Again, this would have been a natural assessment. But here's the thing, and I didn't know this until I was looking into this, but the stones would have been built out of limestone. And when limestone experiences or has contact with the extreme heat, it actually loses its form and begins to melt. So when they would show up to the rubble, it was like all these warped stones. You know, Nehemiah's just thinking, a little bit of mortar, and I think that will work. Decorative almost, right? And they were mocking him. It's like, man, even your stones have melted. How could you possibly build something? Again, it would have been a natural assessment. Again, of course, something that the people saw. Nehemiah did too. You remember his reaction. Verse 3. Now Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him. So here's his co-conspirator. And he said, so here we're getting ready to see him sort of jump in and console his commanding officer or agree with Sandy. And he says there, whatever they build, even if a fox goes up on it, he will break down the stone walls. So even if a fox goes up there and tippy-toes on it, it will fall over. Now what's so funny about this is they believe that the construction would be so weak that it would crumble down even under this small animal. Again, something very flimsy. But why a fox? Well, because at this time, in the area of the ruin, it was saturated with little foxes. We find this in Lamentations chapter 5, verse 18, but I'm going to read to you Lamentation 5, verse 16 through 17, and it says this. It says, the crown has fallen from our heads. And we studied this, remember? Before the nation went into captivity with Babylon, we spent was like 6 months in Lamentations. So we studied this. But it says there, the crown has fallen from our head. It was 4.5 months. And it says, woe to us, for we have sinned. This is Jeremiah's response. Because of this, our heart is faint. Because of these things, our eyes grow dim. Here's verse 18. Because of Mount Zion, which is desolate, which foxes walking about on it. So even Jeremiah knew about the reports, and maybe even physically saw himself, the foxes having saturated the ruins of the wall. But again, it would have been a known fact because this region was flooded with foxes. Now in my notes, to sort of draw, a comparison for us, it's like the squirrels in Sioux City. Man, they're everywhere. When I come out of my house in the morning, it's like a farm. I mean, there's so many squirrels and rabbits, and they're all talking or arguing and eating. But it's sort of like that. And then he says there in verse 4, he begins to pray. And again, what we're going to notice here is Nehemiah's approach to conflict and affliction. He's getting ready to throw up this silent prayer, again, a need for divine intervention. But what I love about this, and this is what we need to pay attention to, Nehemiah's approach to conflict and affliction is this. He chose to pray in lieu of retaliation. In other words, he wouldn't get caught up in the arguments because he knew it would set back production. He didn't want to repay evil for evil, but rather he wanted to commit it to the Lord. And isn't that difficult? It's natural for us to stick out our chest and engage in an argument, and even in righteous indignation and a sense of justice, and we go out there and fight rather than take it to the Lord. But not so with Nehemiah, because look what he says. He says, "Hear, O our God, for we are despised." Again, your people in your image are dishonored and we are disgraced. He says, turn their approach. In other words, they're scoffing on their own heads. Again, here we see that Nehemiah is asking God to sort of turn down the tables and bring down the summit upon them. Again, he's calling for God's condemnation, wrath against them. And he says, and give them as a plunder to a land of captivity. In other words, let them be the booty or the trophy, a prize for the captive. He says, do not cover or hide their iniquity, and do not let their sin be blotted out from before you. For they have provoked you to anger before the builders. Again, here he's saying, don't hide their perversity and their depravity. Again, he's saying, don't ignore their guilt. Lord, don't forget there are natural consequences. I believe hundreds of years from now, Paul the Apostle would say, you are not mocked. Whatsoever man soweth, that shall he reap. And he's engaging with the Lord. And I think that's absolutely permissible. And we'll get into why. But what we see there basically is, Lord, don't cover the scandal, but judge their sin. Again, don't cleanse it and don't forget it. We find in Proverbs chapter 8, verse 13, that the fear of the Lord is to hate what is evil, to abhor it. And he's basically like calling on God, man, just do as you would normally do. But what Nehemiah does there is he says, for they have provoked you to anger before the builders. In other words, before our aid and all of Israel. But what I love about this is essentially he's saying, as our defender, react to their insults. Again, you must be glorified, Lord, so the wall must be repaired. Now here's a thought for you, and I thought this was interesting. Now, how should a Christian interpret this kind of praying? Especially in view of what Jesus Christ said about praying for one's enemies, right? We find that in Matthew chapter 5, verse 44, Romans 12, verse 14 and 20. In fact, several facts need to be noted. First, in opposing the Jews, Sanballat and again his coalition there were actually opposing God. The same principle we find throughout the New Testament, don't we? Especially when we see there in the book of Acts the church being persecuted. Because who showed up to interrupt Saul of Tarsus there on the road to Damascus if you were here on Sunday? It was Jesus. And he said, why are you persecuting my church? No, he said, why are you persecuting me? So first we know that if they were coming against the Jews, ultimately they were opposing God. Secondly, God had already pronounced judgment on all of Israel's enemies. And that pronouncement, that declaration is still active today. All of those nations who go against Israel will be judged. In fact, we find throughout the scriptures multiple judgments. One of them is the judgment of nations. We find that in Matthew chapter 25, verse 41, where he will separate the goats from the sheep. And those goats, those nations who oppose the nation of Israel, context of Matthew chapter 25, eschatology, things to come, they will be judged. They will be judged. And it's going to be gnarly. We also see here that Nehemiah, therefore, was praying according to God's will. He was praying according to God's will, that God would deliver Jerusalem from her enemies. We find this in Joshua chapter 1, verse 5. Third, or as my pastor Raul would say, thirdly, it's funny, Raul lists a lot of things, and after about an hour and 15 minutes of studying, you hear him say, seventhly, or like secondly. It's like, man, I thought we were just like on 15, and now we're back to number 2. You got to take a lot of notes. But thirdly, Nehemiah was praying that God would bring about what he had promised Abraham regarding those who curse his people. We saw that in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. And then fourth, vengeance always belongs to God and not to Nehemiah or us as believers. We find that in Deuteronomy chapter 32, and of course Romans chapter 12, verse 19, where Paul would say, the Lord would say that the vengeance is mine. So he was basically just following and executing the word of the Lord. And then lastly, we're going to finish verses 6 through 9 so we can pray. And then look what he does. You can sort of discover here in verse 6 on through 9 that the enemy's plan backfired. It backfired. It says there, so we built the wall in the midst of these insults, in the midst of these taunts and these disparaging threats. In this oppression, it would function as a motivator. They would now be provoked. They would now be moved. And as I put here in my notes, they would be lit up to build. When they were stirred. And it says there, and the entire wall was joined together up to half its height. So here what we see, even through the inspiration of the enemy's taunts, that Nehemiah's plan, we saw in chapter 3, was working. Unity does breed success. That's why it's so important that we as a ministry get on the same page. Yeah. If anyone asks, well, what do you guys do? We're a reach and teach ministry. What does that mean? Well, we're known for teaching the Bible. We're a Bible teaching ministry. We teach. We don't hand out backpacks, at the beginning of the school year. We don't stand in soup kitchens. Not that those are bad things. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, us as a ministry, what do? We function as a Bible teaching ministry. In fact, I just got an invite to start a new Bible study Monday night. And if the Spanish study was still going on, we would actually be teaching 7 nights a week at that point. I cannot believe it. So please keep me in prayer. I'll be teaching 5 times a week now. But that's what we do, right? That's what we do. We're a teaching ministry. But what we see here is everyone's on the same page. Again, we would see half of the wall or its foundation or its base is established. If you want to put it in sort of a New Testament context, the cornerstone is in place. Right? They got seek ye first done first. And then all these other things will be added. But what I love about this is sort of the fortress of defense is taking shape. Especially to the dismay of the enemy. That must have just ticked him off. As these feeble Jews were building. And it was coming to pass. And it says, for the people had a mind to work. Now I wrote in here, the people have caught the vision. And I tagged it with the question, have you? Have you? Are you praying that God would open doors, that He would give us a platform to teach the Word of God? Have you? This should be something that we petition Him daily. In fact, right now, unfortunately, going through the book of Acts, one characteristic of the apostles that I cannot shake was their boldness. So now I'm praying that we as a body become even more bold. Yeah, look out. So if you're comfy, you're not going to be for much longer. You're going to be stirred. But what we see here with this mind to work, it speaks of this inner or this deep core stirring. Again, I had quoted Jeremiah 20 verse 8 earlier, how it's sort of like it's shut up in their bones. Jeremiah was the type of young preacher that if he didn't preach, he would almost get violently sick. He said, man, I'm not going to, because what was taking place in Jeremiah's time, and we don't have a lot of time, was like Nehemiah, his life was marked by insults and by threats, and he was vilified, and everyone was against him, and he was tired of it. He's like, man, I'm not going to preach in your name anymore. And he took off his garment and threw his Thomas the Chain Reference Bible away, and all of his Calvary materials. Man, I'm never preaching in his name again. And then as he sat alone, it's like this fire lit up through his bones. And he says it was shut in. He got so weary that it was like he was going to vomit unless he went out and said, Jesus Christ is Lord. Same attitude that Paul had in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 16. He said, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. Paul, you want Paul, the apostle, to cry? Don't let him preach. And I know that feeling. Anytime that I'm not allowed to teach it bums me out greater than anything. But what we see here is they had determination. Man, they had determination, they had passion, they had conviction, and they had a sense of commitment. The result, therefore, was rapid progress. Rapid progress. Man, God was doing the work. And now it happened, verse 7, and we got to speed up. It says, when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and then the Ashdites, notice here this forged confederacy, heard the walls of Jerusalem were being restored. In other words, the unthinkable was happening. The feeble Jews were actually successful. And that the gaps, those breaches, were beginning to be closed. They became very angry. Here's what's interesting. Sanballat, because of where he is from, represents the north. Tobiah represents the east. The Arabs, of course, the south there in Geshem. The Amorites and the Ashdodites speak of the west. So here we see this growing coalition coming from all directions against the Jews. And now it's a testimony and a witness to them. Kind of like in our lives. You know, as God does the work, it seems like there are people who are examining and scrutinizing your life from all directions. You don't even realize it. You know, I get messages on Facebook like, man, I thought you were a loser. What happened? Jesus. Return. You know, but it says there, and they became very angry, and all of them conspired together. Again, here they're plotting together, and it's a conspiracy, but it's this evil scheming. These guys were troublemakers. And then it says there, and they were going to come together, and they were going to attack Jerusalem, and they were going to create confusion. Nevertheless, we made our prayers to our God. Again, they sought deliverance and wisdom. Because of them, we sent a watch against them day and night. So here they sort of constructed this outlook post, and people manned it around the clock. Again, here we see sort of this distinctive even for our ministry, prayer plus practical action. But here's how I want to close. Back there on verse 8, what we notice is one of the means and way the enemy attacks. It says there that they wanted to create confusion. Confusion. Now what we discover here is they must have recognized the unity and the order of Nemo's forces. Remember, we spent 2 weeks on that, looking at how orderly the construction efforts were. And they thought to themselves, we must stop and we must hinder the efforts. Therefore, we will create as much trouble for Nemo and his crew as possible. In fact, when you look at their activities, they're very much like terrorists. Again, they wanted to use violence, they wanted to use threats to intimidate, and they wanted to coerce and induce the state of fear. That's one of the things that the Satan likes to do, is create confusion. I know a distinctive in our house, and it comes out of 1 Corinthians, something that Paul said there to the church, that our God, the God we worship, is a God of order. I know in our lives, we're always looking for order in our life. Because for us, that's the spirit or the essence of His presence. If there's order, chances are Jesus is involved. If there's disorder, chances are the champion of that effort is your flesh or Satan. Like here we see the enemy coming to create confusion. So we need to constantly be on the outlook, or the lookout rather, for order. That's who Christ is. He's a God of order. So if you're sitting in like, Hurricane Sandy right now, I would suggest you repent. Really? And repent is simply a change of mind and a change of direction. You don't have to stay in a storm. You can actually turn and head towards Christ, our God, the God of order. Again, these are simple truths. Truths that Nehemiah would abide in. Truths that Paul would mirror and remind us of. And then things that we need to apply to our lives today. Amen? Amen. Certainly lots to pray about. We will finish that chapter next week. Would you please join me in prayer again?